1890 photo found, and experts notice. Something impossible in the background. The Philadelphia summer heat pressed against the windows of the old Chestnut Hill mansion as estate liquidator Michael Torres made his way through the third-floor attic. The Pemberton family had hired him to catalog and appraise the contents of their ancestral home before its sale. 5 generations of accumulated possessions packed into trunks, boxes, and forgotten corners of one of the city's oldest surviving Victorian estates. Michael had been working in estate sales for 15 years, long enough that few discoveries truly surprised him anymore. But as he opened a cedar chest tucked beneath the eaves, wrapped in layers of muslin cloth yellowed with age, he found something that made him pause. A collection of photographs in remarkable condition, protected from light and moisture by their careful storage. The photographs documented the Pemberton family from the 1880s through the early 1900s. Formal portraits, holiday gatherings, children posed stiffly in their Sunday finest. Most were typical for the era: serious expressions, elaborate clothing, the rigid formality that long exposure times demanded. But one photograph stopped him completely. It was a family portrait, larger than the others, mounted on thick cardboard backing. The image showed what appeared to be a wealthy family in their parlor. A distinguished man in his 50s, a woman of similar age seated beside him, and 2 young girls, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, standing between them. The room was elegantly furnished. Heavy drapes, ornate wallpaper, a marble fireplace visible to one side. What caught Michael's attention was something in the background, visible through the parlor window behind the family. A woman's face, partially obscured by the lace curtain but unmistakably there, pressed close to the glass, looking directly at the camera. No, not at the camera. Looking at the children. Michael pulled out his magnifying loupe and examined the image more carefully. The woman in the window appeared to be in her 30s, her features gaunt, her expression a mixture of longing and anguish so intense it was visible even through the blur of the curtain. Her hand was pressed against the glass, fingers splayed as though trying to reach through the barrier. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded brown ink, someone had written, "The Pemberton family, November 1890. Jonathan, Evelyn, Margaret, and Alice." 4 names for the people inside the parlor. No mention of the woman in the window. Victorian photographers were meticulous about controlling their compositions. They wouldn't have allowed an intruder in the frame, especially not someone whose presence was so visually jarring. Unless the photographer hadn't seen her, or unless her presence documented something the family had wanted hidden but couldn't completely erase from the photographic record. At the bottom of the chest, beneath layers of photographs, he found a small leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, filled with cramped handwriting he would need better light to read. Michael spent the evening in his home office, the photograph displayed on his computer screen in high resolution while he carefully examined the leather journal. The handwriting was difficult to decipher, 19th century script, faded ink, personal abbreviations, but as he worked through the pages, a troubling story began to emerge. The journal belonged to Evelyn Pemberton, the woman seated in the photograph, and it covered the years 1888 through 1895. Most entries were mundane: social calls, household management, children's lessons. But scattered throughout were references that seemed coded, deliberately vague. An entry from March 1889 read, "J. brought them home today. Such beautiful girls, so bewildered and frightened. Margaret cried for her mama all evening. I gave her my mother's locket to comfort her." Another from June 1889. "The matter is settled legally now. Dr. Harrison provided all necessary documentation. No one will question the arrangement." Then, from October 1890. "She was there again today, standing across the street watching the house. The same woman who has appeared 3 times this month. Our housemaid says she asks questions at the market about the children, their names, their ages. Jay has contacted the police." Michael's hands tightened on the journal. The entry from November 1890, the same month the photograph was dated, was more revealing. "Today, we sat for the family portrait. In the middle of the exposure, I saw movement outside the window. Her again, that wretched woman, pressed against the glass, staring at Margaret and Alice with such anguish. I could not move without ruining the image. When the photographer finished, she was gone. He never mentioned seeing her, and I cannot bring myself to ask if she appeared in the photograph." Michael sat back, his mind racing. The woman in the window wasn't an accident. She was someone connected to these children, Margaret and Alice, who had been brought home and legally secured through documentation provided by Dr. Harrison. He searched through more entries. The mysterious woman continued to appear occasionally, always at a distance, always watching. In 1892, Evelyn wrote, "It has been months since we have seen her. Jay says the police finally convinced her to leave Philadelphia. The final reference appeared in 1894. Margaret asked me today about her earliest memories. She said she sometimes dreams of a different house, a different woman singing to her. I told her these were simply a child's imagination, but her eyes held such certainty. Michael closed the journal and turned back to the photograph. He zoomed in on the woman's face, enhancing the resolution. Even through the blur, he could see the resemblance, subtle but unmistakable, between the woman in the window and the two girls in the portrait. This wasn't just adoption. This was documentation of something darker. Children taken from their mother, legally appropriated through false documentation, while their biological mother was reduced to standing outside their window, desperate for any glimpse of the daughter she had lost. Michael began his investigation at the Philadelphia City Archives, requesting birth and death records, census data, and court documents related to the Pemberton family. The current Pemberton descendants had given him access to the estate's contents, but had shown little interest in the historical details. They simply wanted the house emptied and sold. The 1890 census listed Jonathan Pemberton, age 52, occupation, attorney, Evelyn Pemberton, age 48, and two daughters, Margaret, age 8, and Alice, age 6. Both girls were listed as daughters, with no notation indicating adoption or guardianship. He searched backward. The 1880 census showed Jonathan and Evelyn Pemberton living in the same Chestnut Hill address with no children listed. The couple had been married since 1875 but had apparently remained childless for at least 15 years. Then, suddenly, in 1889 or early 1890, two young daughters appeared in their household, aged 8 and 6, old enough to have clear memories of any previous life. Michael searched for adoption records or guardianship petitions filed by Jonathan Pemberton. What he found was a single document, dated February 1889, filed with the Orphans Court. A petition for legal guardianship of two minor children, Margaret and Alice Sullivan, ages 7 and 5 respectively. Parents deceased, no other living relatives to provide care. The petition had been approved by Judge William Crawford on February 28, 1889, with supporting documentation from Dr. Edmund Harrison, listed as the family physician who could attest to the children's orphaned status, Sullivan. The children's original surname was Sullivan, not Pemberton. And according to this court document, both parents were deceased. If both parents were truly dead, who was the woman in the window? He requested death certificates for the Sullivan parents. There was a death certificate for Thomas Sullivan, dated November 1888, cause of death. Consumption. Age, 34. Occupation, factory worker. But there was no death certificate for any woman named Sullivan who could have been the children's mother. Michael searched variations of the name, checked asylum records, prison records, poorhouse admissions. Finally, he found something in the records of the Philadelphia Almshouse and Hospital for the Insane at Blockley, an admission record for Catherine Sullivan, dated December 1888, 1 month after Thomas Sullivan's death. Age, 32. Reason for commitment. Severe melancholia and hysteria, following death of husband, unable to care for minor children, declared mentally incompetent by Dr. Edmund Harrison. The same Dr. Harrison who had provided documentation for the Pembertons' guardianship petition, declaring the children had no living parents. Catherine Sullivan hadn't died. She had been institutionalized, declared incompetent, and her children had been taken and given to a wealthy family while she was locked away, unable to protest or fight for them. Michael requested Catherine Sullivan's complete institutional records, his hands trembling as he filled out the archive request forms. The institutional records painted a devastating picture. Catherine Sullivan had been admitted to Blockley in December 1888, shortly after her husband Thomas's death from tuberculosis. The admission papers, signed by Dr. Edmund Harrison, described her as unable to function rationally, poses danger to herself and her children through neglect and emotional instability. But the medical notes from the asylum's own doctors told a different story. Daily observations from the first 3 months described a woman who was grieving, certainly, and struggling with poverty and desperation, but who was neither dangerous nor incompetent. She repeatedly asked about her daughters, begged to be allowed to see them, promised she would find work and housing if only they would let her care for her children. A note from February 1889, written by Dr. Samuel Preston, the attending physician. Patient shows no signs of genuine mental illness. Her distress appears entirely rational given her circumstances. She should be released to appropriate charitable support. However, Dr. Harrison has filed legal documentation declaring her permanently incompetent. Michael found the legal documents, a declaration of permanent mental incompetence, signed by Dr. Harrison and filed with the court the same week the Pemberton's guardianship petition was approved. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. He dug deeper into Dr. Edmund Harrison's background and found that Harrison was not just the Pembertons' family physician, but also Jonathan Pemberton's personal friend. Harrison had testified in several of Pemberton's cases, providing medical expertise. The two men belonged to the same gentlemen's club, attended the same church, moved in the same social circles. The conspiracy became clear. Jonathan and Evelyn Pemberton, childless after 15 years of marriage, had wanted children. Dr. Harrison had provided them with a solution: a vulnerable widow whose husband had just died, who had 2 young daughters and no resources to fight back. Catherine's institutional records showed that in March 1889 she had attempted to escape, making it as far as the asylum gates before being caught and returned. The punishment had been severe: confinement to a locked ward, sedation, restriction of all privileges. But Catherine hadn't given up. Records from June 1889 showed she had written multiple letters to the court, to charitable organizations, demanding her children be returned to her. All her letters had been intercepted by asylum staff and never sent, marked as evidence of continued delusion and obsessive fixation. Then, in August 1889, Catherine had been released, not to freedom, but to outpatient status, a conditional release that allowed her to work outside the asylum but required her to return regularly for monitoring. This must have been when Catherine began appearing outside the Pemberton house, free enough to move through the city, desperate to see her daughters, but legally powerless to reclaim them. Michael found one more document that made his throat tight: a notation from October 1892 stating she had been fully recommitted after repeated harassment of a prominent family, continued evidence of delusional obsession with children not her own. She had been locked away again, this time with no release. Michael knew he needed to find living descendants, both from the Pemberton line and, if possible, from Catherine Sullivan's family. The truth had been buried for over 130 years, but somewhere there might be people who deserved to know what had really happened. He started with the Pembertons, using genealogical databases and public records. Margaret Pemberton had married in 1905 to a man named Harold Whitfield. She had died in 1963 at age 81, leaving 3 children, multiple grandchildren, and a lineage well documented in Philadelphia society records. Alice Pemberton had married Robert Thornton in 1908. She had died in 1959 at 75, also leaving descendants scattered across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Michael created family trees for both women, tracing their lines down to the present day. He found living great-grandchildren of both Margaret and Alice, people who had inherited the Pemberton estate and hired him to liquidate it, people who had no idea their ancestors had been born as Sullivan children, stolen from their mother through legal fraud. Tracing Catherine Sullivan's family proved more difficult. He searched for any siblings, parents, or relatives who might have survived. He found immigration records showing Catherine had come to America from Ireland in 1878, at age 22, sponsored by an older brother named Patrick Sullivan, who had emigrated several years earlier. The 1880 census showed Patrick Sullivan living in Philadelphia's Kensington neighborhood, working at a textile mill, married with 2 young children. But after 1880, Patrick seemed to vanish from the records. He expanded his search to newspaper archives. What he found was a brief article from the Philadelphia Inquirer, dated January 1889. Factory fire claims 3 lives. The article listed the victims, including Patrick Sullivan, age 38. Patrick had died just 2 months after his brother-in-law Thomas, leaving Catherine with no family support at the most desperate moment of her life. The timing explained why she had been so vulnerable. But Patrick had had a wife and children. Michael searched for them, finally finding a notation in poorhouse records. Ellen Sullivan, widow and 2 children, admitted to the Philadelphia almshouse in February 1889, destitute following death of husband. Michael searched asylum records more carefully for information about Catherine's later life. What he found broke his heart. Catherine Sullivan had remained institutionalized at Blockley until her death in 1921 at age 65. She had spent 33 years locked away, dying in the same institution where she had first been confined under false pretenses. Her death certificate listed no next of kin. She had been buried in the asylum's Potter's Field, an unmarked grave among hundreds of others. But the institutional records contained one final piece of information that gave Michael hope. Among Catherine's personal effects, inventoried when she died, was a small bundle of letters and photographs she had somehow managed to keep through decades of confinement. The inventory noted these items had been transferred to the asylum's archives. Michael immediately contacted the Historical Archives of Philadelphia General Hospital, asking if any patient personal effects from that era had been preserved. 3 weeks later, he received an email. They had found a box labeled Sullivan Catherine, Patient Effects 1921, stored in a vault and never opened since it had been archived. Michael stood in the basement archives of Philadelphia General Hospital, wearing white cotton gloves as the archivist carefully opened the sealed box that had remained untouched for over a century. Inside were the fragments of Catherine Sullivan's life, the pieces she had clung to through 33 years of institutionalization. There were 3 photographs, their edges worn from repeated handling. The first showed a young couple on their wedding day, Catherine and Thomas Sullivan, taken in 1880, both barely into their 20s. The second showed the couple with 2 small children, probably taken around 1885. The third was torn and water-stained, but showed the 2 girls, slightly older, sitting formally in a photographer's studio. Michael's throat tightened, realizing Catherine had kept these images through everything. Through her commitment, her escape attempts, her recommitment, 33 years of confinement. These photographs had been her proof that Margaret and Alice existed, that they had been hers. But it was the letters that revealed the full tragedy. There were dozens of them, written on whatever paper she could acquire, asylum stationery, torn scraps, the backs of institutional forms. Most were addressed to her daughters, but never sent. The earliest letter was dated February 1889. My dearest Margaret and Alice, they have taken me away from you, but I promise I will come back. I am not sick, no matter what they say. I am your mama, and I love you, and I will find you as soon as they let me leave this place. Another from 1890. I saw you today. You were in a big house with beautiful dresses and your hair in ribbons. You looked happy and healthy, and I thank God for that, even though my heart breaks that I could only watch you through a window. Do you remember me? Do you remember the songs I used to sing to you? The letters continued through the years, chronicling Catherine's pain as her daughters grew up without her. From 1895, Margaret, you must be 13 now, nearly a young lady. Alice, you are 11. I wonder if you think of me at all, or if they have told you I am dead. From 1900, I heard that Margaret Pemberton was married. You are a bride now, starting your own family. I pray you will be happy. I pray your children will never be taken from you as you were taken from me. The letters from later years showed Catherine's slow acceptance that she would never be reunited with her daughters, but also her determination that the truth should survive. From 1910, I write this knowing you will likely never read it, but I write it anyway so that someday, somehow, someone might know what happened. Your father was Thomas Sullivan. I am Catherine Sullivan. We loved you both more than life itself. The final letter was dated 1920. I am 64 years old now, and I know I will die in this place. But I want you to know, my daughters, that I loved you every day of my life. You were stolen from me, but you were never forgotten. You were always my daughters. If there is any justice in this world or the next, someday you will know the truth. Michael carefully photographed each letter, his vision blurred with tears. Michael spent 2 weeks preparing his presentation, compiling every document he had found: the asylum records, the court petitions, the death certificates, Evelyn Pemberton's journal entries, and most powerfully, Catherine Sullivan's letters and photographs. He created a timeline showing exactly how Jonathan Pemberton and Dr. Harrison had conspired to steal 2 children from their mother. Then he contacted the Pemberton descendants who had hired him, specifically Sarah Whitfield, great-granddaughter of Margaret, and Thomas Thornton, great-grandson of Alice. He asked them to meet with him regarding important historical discoveries about their family. They met in Sarah's home in Bryn Mawr. Sarah was in her 60s, a retired teacher, pleasant and curious. Thomas, roughly the same age, was a physician, somewhat more reserved but clearly interested. Michael began by showing them the 1890 family photograph, pointing out the figure in the window. Did either of you ever hear family stories about this woman? Both shook their heads. Sarah studied the photograph closely. Who is she? Her name was Catherine Sullivan, Michael said quietly. And she was your great-great-grandmother, the biological mother of Margaret and Alice. The silence that followed was profound. Michael watched confusion and disbelief on their faces as he carefully, methodically, walked them through everything he had discovered. He showed them the guardianship petition that claimed both Sullivan parents were dead, then the asylum admission record showing Catherine was alive when that petition was filed. He showed them Dr. Harrison's declaration of incompetence and the asylum doctor's notes contradicting that assessment. He showed them Evelyn Pemberton's journal entries, her acknowledgement of what we have done, her guilt about the woman who kept appearing. He showed them the institutional records documenting Catherine's decades of confinement, her escape attempts, her intercepted letters. Finally, he showed them Catherine's personal letters, her photographs, her testimony written across 3 decades of imprisonment. Sarah was crying before he finished. Thomas sat frozen, his composure cracking as the full horror became undeniable. "They stole them," Sarah whispered. "Margaret and Alice were stolen. Their mother was alive. She was fighting for them. And our ancestors—" She couldn't finish. Thomas's voice was rough with emotion. "My great-grandmother Alice. I knew her when I was a child. She was kind, gentle, always a little sad in a way I never understood." He looked at the photograph. She was 4 years old when they took her. Did she remember? Michael showed them Evelyn's 1894 journal entry about Margaret's dreams of a different woman singing to her. "They remembered," Michael said softly. "At least fragments. But they were children, told their mother was dead, and eventually those memories probably seemed like dreams." Sarah looked at the photograph again, at Catherine's face in the window. She was there at the portrait sitting. She came to see them, even knowing she couldn't approach them. Thomas stood and walked to the window. "What do we do with this information?" he asked finally. "There's Catherine," Sarah said quietly. "She died alone, buried in an unmarked grave. We can give her acknowledgement now. We can tell her story." Sarah and Thomas decided to go public with the story, working with Michael to prepare a comprehensive article for the Philadelphia Inquirer's historical feature section. The newspaper was enthusiastic. It was exactly the kind of story that resonated with contemporary concerns about institutional abuse, wealth inequality, and the powerlessness of vulnerable populations. The article appeared on a Sunday in October, spread across 2 full pages with photographs. The 1890 Pemberton family portrait with Catherine's face in the window, enlarged and enhanced. Catherine's wedding photo, the studio portrait of young Margaret and Alice, and excerpts from Catherine's letters alongside Evelyn Pemberton's journal entries. The headline read, "The Woman in the Window: How a Prominent Philadelphia Family Stole 2 Children and Buried the Truth for 130 Years." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The article was shared thousands of times on social media. Local television news picked up the story. The Philadelphia Bar Association issued a statement condemning Jonathan Pemberton's actions and acknowledging the legal system's complicity. The medical community discussed Dr. Harrison's betrayal of professional ethics. But the most significant responses came from unexpected quarters. A historian specializing in asylum reform contacted Michael with information about dozens of similar cases. Women institutionalized on questionable diagnoses, their children taken and given to wealthier families, all enabled by doctors and lawyers who profited from the arrangements. Several genealogists reached out with research tools that might help trace other branches of Catherine's family tree. The Archives of Philadelphia General Hospital announced they would conduct a comprehensive review of their historical patient records, looking for other cases of wrongful commitment. 3 weeks after the article's publication, Michael received an email that made his hands shake. It was from a woman named Kathleen Murphy in Boston, who explained that her grandmother had been Ellen Sullivan, widow of Patrick Sullivan, Catherine's brother. "My grandmother spoke sometimes about her sister-in-law Catherine," Kathleen wrote. "She said Catherine had been locked away after Thomas died, that her children had been taken. But my grandmother was too poor and powerless to help her. When I saw the article about Catherine Sullivan, I recognized the story. Catherine was my great-great-aunt. Margaret and Alice Sullivan were my grandmother's nieces." Michael immediately connected Kathleen with Sarah and Thomas. The 3 of them, representing different branches of the family, the stolen children's descendants, and the descendants of Catherine's brother, began planning a memorial service to finally honor Catherine's life. The research continued to expand. Michael found records showing Dr. Harrison had provided similar incompetence documentation in at least 6 other cases between 1885 and 1895, all involving poor widows or immigrants, all resulting in their children being placed with wealthy families. Jonathan Pemberton had handled the legal work for 3 of those cases. It had been a system, not an isolated incident. The Pennsylvania Historical Society requested permission to include the photograph and related documents in a permanent exhibit about social justice and institutional reform, placing Catherine's story in the broader context of how vulnerable populations had been systematically exploited. The city of Philadelphia maintained records of burials in the Potter's Field at Blockley, but the records were incomplete and the actual grave sites had never been individually marked. Hundreds of people who had died in the asylum had been buried there between 1870 and 1930, their bodies placed in unmarked plots. Catherine Sullivan's death certificate indicated she had been buried in the Blockley Cemetery in 1921, but there was no specific plot number, no way to know exactly where her remains lay. The cemetery itself had been partially built over when the hospital expanded in the 1950s, but Sarah Whitfield was determined. She contacted archaeologists and historians who specialized in recovering lost burial sites, and together they began mapping the old cemetery boundaries, cross-referencing historical records with ground-penetrating radar surveys to locate individual graves. The process took months, but eventually they identified a section that corresponded to burials from 1920-1922, the period when Catherine would have been interred. While they couldn't identify her specific grave with certainty, they could narrow it down to an area of roughly 30 graves. Sarah, Thomas, and Kathleen decided that would be enough. They worked with the city to install a memorial marker at the site, a granite stone with bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Catherine Sullivan, 1856-1921, and all those buried here who died far from their families, their stories untold." Catherine Sullivan was wrongfully institutionalized in 1888 and spent 33 years confined at Blockley Hospital. Her daughters, Margaret and Alice, were taken from her through legal fraud and raised by another family. She never stopped fighting for them, never stopped loving them, never stopped being their mother. This memorial is placed by her descendants to ensure she is finally remembered, acknowledged, and honored. "You were always my daughters. You were never forgotten." Catherine Sullivan, 1920. The dedication ceremony took place on a clear November day, almost exactly 133 years after Catherine had been first committed. More than 100 people attended, descendants from all branches of the family, historians, advocates for asylum reform, representatives from mental health organizations, and journalists. Sarah spoke about her great-great-grandmother Margaret, about how Margaret had lived a comfortable life, but had always seemed haunted by something she couldn't articulate. "Now I understand what haunted her," Sarah said. "She had been torn from her mother at age 7, and some part of her never forgot." Thomas read excerpts from Catherine's letters, his voice breaking as he read, "I loved you every day of my life. You were stolen from me, but you were never forgotten." Kathleen spoke about her grandmother Ellen, about the guilt Ellen had carried for being unable to help her sister-in-law. "But we can fight now," Kathleen said. "We can make sure this story is told." The memorial was unveiled, and each person present placed a flower at its base, red roses, remembering the blood and sacrifice Catherine's story represented. 6 months after the memorial dedication, Michael stood in the new exhibit at the Pennsylvania Historical Society. The permanent installation, titled "Stolen Lives, Family Separation in Industrial America," used Catherine Sullivan's story as its centerpiece, but included documentation of dozens of similar cases. The 1890 Pemberton family photograph was displayed in a large backlit frame, but the museum had created 2 versions, displayed side by side. The first version showed the photograph as the Pemberton family had intended it, cropped to exclude the window, showing only Jonathan, Evelyn, Margaret, and Alice in their elegant parlor, a portrait of prosperity and respectability. The second version showed the complete photograph, uncropped, with Catherine's face in the window enhanced and highlighted. The museum had also found the 1885 photograph of Catherine with her young daughters, mounted directly beside the 1890 portrait. The visual effect was powerful. Viewers could see Catherine as a young mother, happy and whole, holding her daughters close. Then they could see her 5 years later, reduced to a face pressed against glass, separated from those same daughters by wealth, law, and institutional power. A wall text explained the complete story, including excerpts from Catherine's letters alongside Evelyn Pemberton's guilt-ridden journal entries, showing both the victim's suffering and the perpetrator's awareness of wrongdoing. The final section documented the rediscovery of the story and the reconciliation between different branches of Catherine's family. There were photographs from the memorial dedication, images of Sarah, Thomas, and Kathleen standing together at Catherine's grave. The exhibit had attracted significant attention, with school groups, social work students, legal historians, and genealogists making regular visits. Many visitors left comments in the museum's guest book. "My great-grandmother was institutionalized in the 1930s for hysteria," one visitor wrote. "Her children were told she was dead. This exhibit helped me understand what she went through. I work in child protective services," another comment read. "This story reminds me why we must always listen to parents, why we must question systems that make it easier to take children than to support struggling families." Sarah Whitfield had become an advocate for asylum reform and historical justice, giving talks about her great-great-grandmother's story. She had established a scholarship fund in Catherine Sullivan's name, providing support for single mothers pursuing education. Thomas Thornton, using his position as a physician, had begun working with medical ethics boards to ensure contemporary doctors understood the historical abuses committed by medical professionals who had used their authority to enable injustice. Kathleen Murphy had compiled a comprehensive family history, documenting not just Catherine's story, but the broader Sullivan family narrative, connecting with dozens of Sullivan descendants who had never known about Catherine. Michael often visited the exhibit, always pausing before that photograph, looking at Catherine's face pressed against the window. What had once seemed impossible, a mysterious figure in the background, now seemed profoundly human. A mother's desperate love, made visible when the camera's shutter opened. The photograph had documented a crime, preserved evidence that would take 130 years to interpret. But it had also preserved something the perpetrators couldn't erase: Catherine's presence, her witness, her refusal to disappear even when every institution conspired to make her vanish. On the exhibit's anniversary, Sarah, Thomas, and Kathleen stood together before the photograph. Sarah carried a framed copy of Catherine's final letter. "She was right," Sarah said quietly. "We were always her daughters, Margaret and Alice, and through them, all of us. Catherine gave them life and love and an identity that survived even when it was buried for over a century." The photograph that had once celebrated the Pemberton family's prosperity now told a different story, one of theft and loss, but also of survival and eventual justice. The woman in the window was finally, completely seen: Catherine Sullivan, mother, victim, and ultimately, through the persistence of truth, victor over those who had tried to erase her from history. Her face in that window, captured on a November day in 1890, had ensured her story would eventually be told, that her daughters would be recognized as hers, and that the crime against her would finally be acknowledged. The photograph had kept its secret for 133 years, but now, at last, Catherine Sullivan's voice could be heard. "I loved you. I never stopped loving you. I was always your mother." And finally, her daughters, and all their descendants, could answer, "We know. We remember. We honor you."